Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock Central European time. Good morning in Europe and good afternoon in Asia and the Far East. My name is Alberto Canepari. I am co-founder and board member of GC&P. GC&P is a consultancy firm based in Italy. We support manufacturing company in dealing with the challenges of the environmental transformation. So calculating the carbon footprint, reporting their sustainability activities, and also CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism practices. Let me introduce to you my colleague and senior advisor for CBAM practices, Jacopo Santi. Together with Jacopo, we will guide you in this 60 minutes webinar in CBAM practices. And we hope that at the end of this meeting, you will be able to understand why CBAM has a reason to exist and how to report according to CBAM. The 4 topics we will cover in the webinar are, first of all, we will introduce to you the world of sustainability and how sustainability can be a competitive advantage for your business nowadays in Europe and in the world. The second topics will be related to CBAM. So what a company, a producer outside the European Union and willing to sell inside the European Union has to do. Third topics or chapter of the webinar will be about the carbon footprint calculation and how to report the carbon footprint of an organization and of a product. This is a very important topic because it is the base, the origin from where CBAM comes from. At the end of this webinar, as the fourth of the 4 topics, we will guide you through a real example on how to report CBAM emissions, product emissions for the European Union. So thank you again for taking part in our webinar. And please, Jacopo, let's start with our first topics. Sorry, Jacopo, we cannot hear you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was saying thank you, Alberto, for introducing me and for summarizing the topic so well. I see some familiar names between the participants that I'm glad. And without waiting any further, let's get into the topics of the meeting. So we'll start talking about what is sustainability and why it is a competitive advantage. So start thinking, we know that a growing number of customers are starting to inquire about the emissions of organizations and the emission related to products. This links, of course, to CBAM, where even importers are now interested in this kind of topic. And we see in Italy and in the world, organizations starting making moves. And in this situation, mostly also to import, the ones that will move faster will gain, in our opinion, market share. And we know that now the legislative requirements will impose also strictly rules on the designing of products. So it is possible, due to the fact that it is possible to launch greener products and services. So we know that we will have higher and higher environmental standards here in the EU. And this, for you that are outside, that produce outside of our borders, it is something to think about, because as I said earlier, these are imposed rules and we will have to abide by them. So those of you that will be able to be more ready in the short future will gain a big competitive advantage. But how can the situation be addressed? This links also to how we approach the CBAM issue. So the first step is always to map the actual situation. So then it's possible to evaluate how improvements are possible. Then, of course, you need to act on what you have discovered, check the result, and then repeat the process again and again to be always better. The real answer, as Alberto said, is to have a system in place, which has been born for some time now, that is strictly linked to the carbon footprint calculation or internationally recognized certifications. And then talking about CBAM, what is it required to do? Well, of course, many of you already know that CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is a system that has been in place for over a year now. It is strictly linked to the emission trading system here in Europe, and it aims to avoid carbon leakage, so the delocalization carbon production of carbon emissions. It is a carbon pricing system, of course. Now nobody has to pay for CBAM certificates, but in a little more than a year, CBAM will exit the transitional period and importers will have to buy CBAM certificates. It's important to know that importers bear all the responsibilities. This means that you don't risk sanctions, but you risk that if your data won't be reliable, if your data will be too high, you risk losing commercial partners, of course, because the importers will be subject to possible sanctions. What do they need to do? They need, of course, to report the embedded emissions, so the emissions to be considered inside the products that comes inside European borders. Of course, not all of the goods are under CBAM eyes. There is a list. You can find it in Annex 2 of the implementing regulation that helps you check if the goods that you produce and you sell to the European Union are under the CBAM eye. The key factor is the custom code with which the goods are imported. As we were saying before, importers will have to pay for the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that they will import. The price is quite high, and we expect it to go much higher. So that goes without saying that importers will give relevance to the amount of emissions of their suppliers. Of course, the less the emission, the less certificate they'll need to buy. Going more in deep of the topic, as I said, we are in the transitional period. This means there is still time to improve. We have a little more than a year, and after the end of the transitional period, the CBAM certificate system will come into place, and also the data from suppliers will be subject to a verification process. There will be an expert that will verify the CBAM reports of the importers. So the data will be checked. Some of the producers outside of the EU, in the meeting that I've been having, asked me, but what happens if one of my competitor, one of the other supplier of my client, makes up value, so declares lower emissions? as I explained to them, I want to explain to you that at the moment there is not such a big risk related to this issue, because the verifier will be the one that says if the data are reliable or not. So lying now to take time, it's not a very long-term oriented strategy. Again, what do importers need to do? They need to declare direct emission calculated. So these emissions are those caused by production, and also the indirect emission that you will calculate that are caused by the electricity consumption. Some importers, we know, are already amending their contracts with producers to include CBAM data as a prerequisite for the business relationship. So it may not seem so yet, but it is very real, and it will be more and more in place with time. What are direct emissions? I've explained it to some of you already. So they are the emissions caused by the production processes of your installation, but also for the production of all relevant precursor. So the relevant precursor are other CBAM goods that are the input of a production process. You can again check it with the annex of the implementing regulation, specifically Annex 2 and 3 give you information on this issue. And then the indirect emissions, they are caused by the electrical energy consumption to produce CBAM goods. If the electricity is bought from the grid, there are internationally recognized standards to convert the quantity consumption into carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. But if the producer has renewable energy that can be proved to be renewable by certificates, or produces its own energy, maybe with solar panels or wind powered plant, the emission factor can be lowered. As I was saying before, the CBAM goods are listed in Annex 2 of the implementing regulation. How can you calculate the relevant data? This is how we approach the beginning of the work with producers. We start with an introduction about the regulation for those who are new to the topic. And then we start in a very practical way to map the production process and how the goods move inside their organization. We have an example of what we usually do. It is an easy situation due to the fact that it would take too much time to go in depth of a complicated example, but we will show how we work on this issue. The second step to do is to evaluate the input, so the materials that the producer buys, and the output of the production process, and to double check both lists of goods with the CBAM goods list. Then the waste mapping is due, so to analyze if there are waste gases, if there are other kind of waste, what is the destination that the route that they take, if they're reused or not, to take into account also those emissions. And then there is the need to evaluate the supply chain. Why? Because you need to know which of your suppliers are relevant for CBAM, and you can do that knowing from whom you buy CBAM relevant precursors. After that, you know who to contact, and you need to ask them to do pretty much the same work that you have done up to this point to get the direct emission of their production process, so you can use the data as the conversion factor for the precursor that you are using in your installation. And then the question is, how can you be proactive? And the answer, and Alberto will be able to explain it to you much better than how I ever could. The answer is the carbon footprint calculation.
Thank you, Jacopo. So let's dedicate a few minutes to the topics from all the CBAM question starts. The carbon footprint incorporated to products or to organization calculation. So let me give 1 second to share again the screen. Sorry, 1 second. Small issue here. Here it is. So what is the carbon footprint? The carbon footprint measures your company's environmental impact. Your company or your product's environmental impact. It is a useful indicator to express the total greenhouse gases emissions, direct or indirect, associated with a product, service, or your organization. Usually, the value is expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent. The CFP carbon footprint is a comprehensive approach. It becomes a benchmark to check the improvements through the years. So it becomes a benchmark for you from 1 year to the other, but it becomes also a benchmark for you against other businesses close to you or in other countries. CFP is just the first step because once you measure something, you have all the elements to start improving that figures. So after the calculation of the carbon footprint, a decarbonization plan is needed. Now, let's see how to calculate the carbon footprint. But before we say that, let just let me just speculate a few more seconds on the the decarbonization plan necessity, which is basically a necessity also for the CBAM, because once it from 2026, 26 companies importing goods from outside the European Union, they will have to pay based on the amount of emissions. So if there is a decarbonization process also from outside, businesses outside the European Union, they will be more competitive because their importers will pay less for the incorporated emissions. So that's why decarbonization plan is the second step, is very much related to the carbon footprint calculation. Now, let's see how we calculate the carbon footprint. So, the carbon footprint basically takes into account three areas as represented in the scheme to the left, to the right. So the first area is scope 1 emissions. These are direct emissions from the installation, from your plant, such as combustions of natural gas, for instance. Then we have scope 2 emissions. These are emissions considered not direct but indirect emissions, and they are related to energy consumption, the energy we buy from the grid. We can buy clean energy, we can buy energy produced through combustion of carbon, which is much more polluting and has much more emissions incorporated. Then we have scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions to our organization, to our plant, and are related to the raw materials we use, are related to the logistics to move goods, are related to the uh, business travels we have to do for sales, marketing, or technical reasons in our country or around the world. And these are emissions related to other factors also. So the sum of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 gives the overall carbon footprint in terms of CO2 emissions. Now, what's our methodology to calculate the carbon footprint according to scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but also according to the flow of information inside any organization? So, first of all, we have the logistics from the suppliers, and we have to calculate the emissions related to the logistics. Then we have the raw materials, different raw materials, and we have calculated emissions related to the raw materials. And to do that, we have to understand the volume of raw materials entering the organization, and we have to get the emission factors based on the different kind of materials. Then we have the production inside the organization, and we have the combustion processes. For instance, if we use natural gas or carbon or oil or other fossil fuels. Then we have the energy consumption, which is mainly the primary energy, electricity, which is measuring kilowatts per hour. And also based on the kind of energy we buy, we have a different emission factor. Then we have losses of F gases to the atmosphere, and we have waste that we produce, that we need to take into account based on the amount of waste produced or based on the amount of F gases released in the atmosphere. Then we have the logistics to the customers, to reach our customers in our country or in the world. And this is based, of course, on the client distance, and the calculation factor is based also on the type of transportation we use. Train has little impact. The airplane, transport by plane has big impact. And then we have other activities, such as the daily commuting travels that the people working for our organization have to do, or the business travels that we do around the world using different types of transportation, and so on. So overall, this is the calculation of the carbon footprint. This is all right. We need to calculate and take into consideration these variables for calculating the organization carbon footprint, but also for calculating the product carbon footprint. Now, Are all these emissions included in the CBAM? No. CBAM starts from this kind of variables, but it takes into account just a few of them. So when we talk about CBAM, we need to take account the combustion of fuels inside the organization, which is typically direct emission. So scope one, I would say, if we use the greenhouse gas protocol, then we take into consideration the energy consumption, primary energy or electricity, which is scope 2, as we have seen in the previous slide. Then we take into consideration some raw materials that CBAM call precursors. And this, according to the greenhouse gas protocol, is type 3 emission. So these are the differences between calculating the carbon footprint according to international protocol and according to CBAM. So now, once we calculate the carbon footprint, a decarbonization plan is needed. Why is needed? Because the less emission, so the less pollution, I would say, the less cost for your clients will bear to import. This from 1st of January 2026. So it's a way for those achieving better results in terms of reduction of emissions to gain competitivity, to get more market share, and then to get a better return on investment. So you see, carbon footprint, reducing carbon footprint is not just a way to be good. It's not just a way to do good to the society, to do something good for the world, but it's also to gain competitive advantage, to grow our business, to get a better return on investment. And this to us is very important. And it has nothing negative in itself. It's positive that we can do good to others and do good to ourselves because it means that our commitment to decarbonize will be much stronger. So, as we have just said, how we can decarbonize, understand how much we emit or pollute, determine where we can get results, decrease our emissions. Typically, primary energy consumption, it's an area where it's quite simpler to get results quicker. How? For instance, changing contracts with our grid supplier of primary energy from a carbon-based primary energy production to a sustainable production of primary energy through solar or wind or other means. Then with also the possibility to implement a compensation mechanism wherever possible of our emissions. But this comes at the later stage. First is to understand the potential we have to decarbonize inside our organization. And then, as a second step, the remaining emissions, we can compensate them through compensation mechanism. So back to you, Jacopo, for the final part of our webinar with a practical example on how to calculate the incorporated emissions of products according to CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. And here we are. You should be seeing my screen again. So we will divide this last part of the webinar into main areas. The first one is the first step needed, as we were saying before, which is the production process mapping. And the second step will be an example on how to fill the Excel template. That it is a tool provided for everybody to use from the European Commission. It is not mandatory, but it is considered a best practice on the topic. So now we will start looking at production processes. So this is the first example. This is pre-filled, and there are three main areas. The first one is your installation. So the black box represents who you are, and then there is the environment in which you find yourself. So the market and the suppliers. As we said before, we start mapping the production processes. So what is physically done inside of our installation, and then looking at it with the CBAM, we can group different steps if no goods exit from the first one to the market. In this situation, we have unwrought aluminum, which is a relevant precursor for CBAM, that enters into the scrap pre-treatment process. All the goods that gets in the process are then sent to the fusion and casting step. After that, we have the goods, the finished goods that are then sold to the market. As we can see on the top right corner of the screen, there is the electricity consumption, which is both from the market, which is the cause of indirect emission that needs to be accounted for. And also, in this situation, there are also emissions from combustion. This is very high, so to speak, in the supply chain as steps. We have also an easy example of how the installation of an installation that works further down the supply chain. Here, billets and ingots are both. There is an extrusion process, a machining process, an anodizing one, and the final step is painting. As you can see, there are materials exiting the production process at each step. So in this situation, we would have 4 different steps, 4 different production processes in CBAM eyes. But I imagine that seeing it like this can be of not so much help. And then that's why we prepared a more practical example in the next slide. So we said that there is who you are, so your installation, where you are, the market you work into, and also there are, of course, your clients, which are the final recipient of your goods, and your suppliers, those who sell to you the raw materials, which can or cannot be relevant precursors. What we suggest to do is start looking inside. So what are the production processes? What physical steps are done inside the installation? In the example we selected, and it is also from one of the template examples provided by the European Union, so it will be easier for you then to recollect the slides that our marketing department will share with everyone here, with all the participants at the end of the meeting. So you will be able to look at both the production process mapping, and also a field Excel template so you can orient yourself better. So as I was saying, what do you do inside your installation? There is the first production process that works on carbon steel, and another production process that works on high alloy steel. Here, the production aims to sell to the market screws and nuts. Okay, so once you know what you do inside your installation, you need to ask yourself, what do I buy to do these things? So in this situation, there is one supplier that sells to the installation carbon steel that goes, of course, in the raw material storage, and then inside the carbon steel production process, and then the goods are sold to the client. The second supplier sells to this installation high alloy steel, again, in the raw material storage, in the high alloy steel production process, to the client as finished goods. So we have two production processes that we will need to account for in the Excel template. We suggest you use the Excel template because it helps you with calculation. But from the market, as we can see in the top right end of the screen, there is another input, which is electricity. In this situation, 5.04 megawatt hour of electricity are consumed in the relevant time period that we are considering. And of course, both the steps, both the production processes consume electricity. And also, to heat up the metal, there is a natural gas consumption, 1,837.5 tons of gas are consumed in this example. And again, both production processes are cause of consumption of natural gas. What's next? Next, we need to divide to understand how much precursor we buy. From the first supplier, we buy 20,000 ton carbon steel. All the 20,000 ton goes into the carbon steel production process, and from these 20,000 tons of carbon steel, 17,000 tons of goods are produced. So we will account of two different numbers from the precursor we buy and for the goods we produce. Of course, there are scraps during the production process. And for the second of the precursors, we have 10,000 tons of high alloy steel, which enter the high alloy steel production process, which are then transformed into 8,200 tons of finished goods sold to the client. Now, we start looking at the energy consumption. So we need to divide the electricity consumption and the natural gas consumption for each production process that requires them. The electricity consumed in the first production process is this amount. In the second production process is this amount. This will help to attribute the indirect emission in a more precise way. We will know where the carbon dioxide, so to speak, is produced. So where the electricity is consumed, and so we will be able to divide the carbon dioxide production caused by the electricity production between the different goods. Talking about the natural gas. The natural gas is, before the natural gas, there is the emission factor. The emission factor is a bit tricky because if you have, if there are internationally recognized factors, for example, those published by EEA, International Electricity Agency, or maybe your government is publishing some official value, you can use them. If you do produce your own energy, or if you have special contract with your supplier of electricity, you can lower the emission factor, it is possible to lower it to almost zero, of course. And then the natural gas. We need to know the net calorific value of the gas, so how much energy it is able to produce per ton, and also how much carbon dioxide equivalent for each terajoule is caused by its consumption. In this situation, we have divided then the quantity of natural gas between the two production processes. As you can see, it can seem a bit confusing, but it's quite a logical process. The precursors. We need to know three things about the precursors we buy, and we use the specific embedded direct emissions, which are on the top left of the screen, and also the specific embedded indirect emissions and the emission factor used for that electricity consumption. How is this possible? Well, actually, these kind of data are the same kind of data that the importers use to do their declaration of CBAM goods every 3 months. So what you can do is help your suppliers fill the same kind of document you will have to fill for your European customer, and after during the Excel template filling, I'll show you where you can find those values, and taking the value that comes as an output from the Excel template to fill your own Excel template in the relevant precursor sheet of the file. In this situation, we have the data we need, and also we have the data we need from the other supplier. And that's pretty much everything you need to know. So what comes next is a case study. We are going to fill together the Excel template, and a blank version of the Excel template, and you should see it now. I'll take a moment before getting inside the actual filling to explain a little but important thing. There are various kinds of cell in the template. You can see the code, you can see the color explanation in sheet, not capital B, guidelines and conditions. You have the yellow ones, which are mandatory cells where data are needed, the light yellow ones, which are not mandatory, so optional value can be inserted here. Some of these will become mandatory. I'll show you where they are. The green cells are auto-filled by the system. The white cell with gray text are those who are whose content has become irrelevant due to some other values that you have already put inside the Excel template. And the gray boxes, you can see some of them on the top of the Excel file. These are for navigation purposes. These little boxes down here helps you check if you're doing things correctly. The red ones will tell you where data are or not needed. The green ones will tell you you have successfully completed this section. The white one indicates that data is not required in that particular row. Without further ado, let's go into the filling. As you can see, there are some on the top of my screen. There are some cells highlighted in red. This helps you know if you have successfully filled a section of the file. As you can see, the about the installation section is gray because to save some time, I have already filled this because it's quite straightforward. Here you need to put the data of your installation and where the emissions are caused. If we go and take this out, I'm sorry, we can do this. If we take this value out, everything is gray. If we start filling, red boxes appear. So give me a second to get back them here. Okay. So the reporting period, you can either calculate the emissions for a trimester, or you could, you can calculate the emission for a year or for a small time frame. The smaller time frame you can report for is 3 months. The reporting period I've selected for this example is the whole 2024, so 31st of December 2024. And pressing enter or exiting that cell, the reporting period box will go back to gray. Exactly. These are some of the cells that will be mandatory with time. Here, the verifier data will be needed. But then we go into the real filling. So we need to talk about the goods categories that we produce. In Annex 2, you can know which custom code the goods you sell fall into. And with that information, you can know in which aggregated goods category the goods you produce are. In this situation, we are producing only iron or steel products. As you can see, the green box is automatically filled and nothing else is required. Just to give you an example, if pig iron was one of the products, we would also need to declare how this pig iron has been produced. The next section, the next part of section 4, talks about the relevant production processes. So in this section, as we have seen before, we have two kinds of production processes. Here, we always produce iron and steel products. As you can see here, only iron and steel products is available because in this section here, we selected only that. We need to say how we produce them. So only direct production because only this kind of goods are produced in this situation. And also we need to give it a name. So it will be easier for us than to navigate through the process because we will see this data further down the file. So we call it carbon, steel, screws, and nuts. And we'll call the other one high alloy steel, screws, and nuts. As you can see, there is an error message until we put in the name. The system guides you and helps you to understand if you're missing something. The next section is relevant for the part where the precursors are relevant. In this situation, you need to do the same process you did before. Check which custom code the precursors fall into, see which category they are, and then indicate it here. In this situation, we have iron or steel products and iron or steel products. We said before we have two kinds of precursors, so the carbon steel and the high alloy steel. The country code is pretty straightforward. In this situation, the carbon steel is both from China, and the high alloy steel is both from the US. As you can see on the top of the screen, we have filled all the needed parts. Remember, the system can't tell you if you have filled it with the correct data. It only can tell you if you have put in all the data required. After this, we need to go into the second sheet to be filled. In this situation, there are emissions caused by the installation for production purposes, which are emissions caused by combustion. As you can see, boxes have become mandatory. We burn, as we've seen before, natural gas, and we burn 1,837.5 unit of measure tons of natural gas, which has a net calorific value in our example of 48 gigajoule each ton, and an emission factor of 56.10 ton each carbon dioxide terajoule produced. As we can see at the end of the file, data are calculated for us. Of course, the data are correct only if you put in correct data before. In this situation, we have nothing more to enter in this sheet. There are situations where you also need to fill table B and table C. In table B is only relevant for some kind of aluminum production. In this example, we're talking about iron and steel products. So here is everything we need to account for. Emission and energy sheet is the next one due. We can see that data from the previous sheet are already pre-filled, and we only have these boxes to fill. The total indirect emissions in this situation is quantity consumed times the relevant emission factor. So in this, for the total, well, if you have the data for each ton of product produced, you also need to multiply for the total production level. In this situation, I've already did the calculation to save time. It's 4198 tons of CO2 equivalent produced by electricity. Here we need to account for how the data quality can be assured. We have a few possible options. In this case, we could put in the mostly measurements and international standard factors, for example, for some emission factor. We also have international standards. There was once the possibility to use mostly default values provided by the European Commission, but that window has closed at the end of the second declaration for 2024. As you can see, no justification is needed, but now we need to inform how the quality assurance of the data is can be proved. There are internal audits. There is a third-party verification when someone verifies the data for you, or the 4I principle, where two independent persons inside the same installation do the calculations and try to get the data. In this situation, which is the one we see more often, the 4I principle is the one we will select. And now we get inside the processes. There are some value we need to take out. Okay. So talking about processes, we said that there are two processes in the first sheet, if you remember, two here, and we have two processes here, 1 and 2. How can we fill it? We said before that the data regarding the processes in this sheet, we talk about the quantity of production. So in our example, it's 17,000 tons, which are all produced for the market. So we will need to put in here also 17,000. A good question that you might have is, but what if my production process 1 sends goods to production process 2? So you need to say if some of the goods are sold, you account for them here. And let's say that 7,000 tons of goods are then sent to production process 2, you go account for them in this box here. So the system can talk between production processes. In this situation, we sell everything we produce. And now the this section has become irrelevant because 100% of the production is sold. Here we are going to put in the data regarding our production process. So we need to divide. To remember, we have this level of direct emissions here. In this situation, as we will see in the purchase precursor, we work on twice the quantity of goods in production process 1 than we do in production process 2. In this situation, almost a 2-to-1 ratio is the correct value between the two different production processes. So we have 3.338 here. We will. Sorry, not 3338 here, and also for this production process. On the electricity consumption, we said before that this process consumed 3,400 megawatt per hour with an emission factor of 0.833. What does the 0.4b means? You have a list of possible sources for the emission factor. Clicking on this link, all of them are explained in the next sheet, and we will see it really quickly. This is where you need to look. In this situation, it's an emission factor based on other publicly available data representing either the average emission factor or the carbon dioxide equivalent, a carbon dioxide emission factor as in Annex 4 of the CBAM regulation. If your country is publishing data, that's what you want to select. There is no electricity exported, so no emissions factor for electricity here is needed. On production process 2, we need to account for how much we produce, which is 8,200 tons of goods, and we sell all of them. Same thing as before, no measurable heat relevant, no waste gases relevant. We need to account for the quantity, which is 1,610, and also the quantity of electricity consumed and the emission factor for this situation. And here again, 0. We're almost at the end of our filling because we only need to talk about the purchase precursors. So what about them? We know that the purchase precursor amounted to 20,000 tons of goods in the first situation. And here we need to see where do these goods go? These 20,000 goes here in the carbon, steel, screws, and nut production process, and none of them goes into the high alloy steel, screws, and nut process. Please put in 0, otherwise, even if no goods goes there, because otherwise you'll keep seeing an error. Control cell highlighted. Regarding the last part of this precursor, we need to say what are the embedded emissions. And here is where your suppliers comes in the game. We need to know what is the ton of carbon dioxide equivalent each ton of goods brings with them. In this situation, we have a 1.539 measured emission factor and 0.346 megawatt per hour per ton consumed with an emission factor of 0.590 coming from a mix of electricity. Same goes for the next one. As we can see here, we will put 10,000 goods, 10,000 tons of goods both. None of them goes into alloy steel screws and nuts, and none of them goes into the carbon steel screws and nuts, but all of them goes into the alloy steel screws and nuts. No data here. And then we need to put in the specific emissions. So 1.440 measured emission factor, 2.079 measured quantity or per ton, 0.833 emission factor coming from a mix of electricity. Where can you find this data? You can find them if the supplier will give you something like this. You'll find them here, and here. But it will make more sense after we fill the last two sheets. If a carbon price instrument is in place in your country, you need to account for it here. In this situation, there is no carbon pricing instrument in the country we are working in, and also no additional information are possible. Now we need to divide the emissions for the different goods we produce. So we'll say that from carbon steel screws and nuts, we have what is the custom code. We know that is 73181542. Only the possible custom codes will appear here. For the second production process, so the high alloy steel screws and nuts, we have another kind of custom code, which is this one. I've already left in the names because it would be pretty pointless to describe them. We suggest to you that you put in here, oh, no, sorry, no, it wasn't the names. We can call them screws and nuts article 1 and screws and nuts article 1A1, article A1. As you can see, it's already populated with data. Summary communication is what is the least amount of information you need to provide to your suppliers. Here you can see that for the first custom code, there is a 2.007 specific embedded emission factor, a 0.407 specific embedded indirect emission, and a total of 2.414 specific embedded total emission. None of them were calculated by default values, and the quantity of embedded electricity are listed here. So with this, and this data from your supplier, you will be able to fill this section here for each of your relevant precursors. Hoping that this will help you, I'll give the screen to Alberto again to finish the presentation.
Thank you, Jacopo, for this overview of the Excel file. I hope, guys, that now you will be able at least to start filling in the Excel file, or you will at least be able, you have been at least be able to understand how it works. Now, we are at the end of our webinar, but first of all, let me tell you two very important things. In order to measure your carbon dioxide emissions incorporated to products, you need to take into consideration two things. One, you have to measure electricity and combustion processes inside your installation, and you have to allocate to different processes the consumption of electricity and combustion. So you need to have this system into place. The other very important thing is if you have precursors, so if you buy raw materials from outside, from other suppliers, which are relevant to CBAM and are called precursors, then you need that your supplier has a system like that into place. Otherwise, you will not be able to incorporate emissions related to precursors. So ideally, I would say that also your supplier of precursor will have to fill in an Excel file such as the one that Jacopo has just shown to us. So thank you so much for taking part in this webinar. We wish you a good day or a good evening, and we hope to have you again in other video calls or webinars in the next few days. So from my side, bye-bye. And also I think from
Bye.
Jacopo's side. See you soon.